This is The Wicklings and the Great Christmas Heist, written by Barrel Coots.
Inside Grand Pomfret Hall, 6 tiny Wicklings and their secret friend Mary dream of a real Christmas feast. With a map of Perilous Plenty and brave, whisper-quiet missions, they face moonlit kitchens, cellar shadows, and a cat with lightning paws. A cozy winter adventure for ages 5 to 11 about courage, clever plans, and heartwarming friendship. Open the door in the skirting board. Christmas is waiting on the other side.
The Wicklings and the Great Christmas Heist. Chapter 1. A Scent of Spices on the Air. Pomfret Hall always grew quieter in winter, but it was a busy sort of quiet. Outside, frost painted the world. Each blade of grass stood stiff and sparkling like a diamond in the weak afternoon sun. A cold snap had settled over the countryside, nipping noses and drawing icy pictures on the window panes. Inside, a different kind of magic was beginning. 9-year-old Mary Pomfret pressed her nose to the cold drawing room window, her breath making a little foggy circle. She watched servants and delivery boys come and go through the kitchen courtyard. One man carried a sack of flour over his shoulder and dusted the path white. Another wobbled under a basket of glossy, red-skinned apples. But the smells told the real story. Warm, rich smells slipped out from under the kitchen door and curled up the staircases. Mary could smell yeasty bread baking, sweet mincemeat pies, and the sharp, spicy tang of mulled wine warming by the fire. It smelled like Christmas, and it made the grand, chilly house feel cozy and alive. As she watched and sniffed, a small sadness pricked her, sharp as the frost outside. Down here, everything was big and loud and full of cheer. But up above, hidden in the quiet attic of the West Wing, her very best friends could only imagine it. Her friends were the Wicklings, a family of 6 little people, no bigger than Mary's hand. There was Sidney, the father, wise and kind. Beatrix, the mother, clever and brave. Their son Stanley, 13, full of daring ideas. Their daughter Poppy, 11, as curious as a wren. And the 8-year-old twins, Mindy and Mandy, always finding mischief. They lived secretly behind the walls, and only Mary knew. While the humans prepared a grand Christmas feast, the Wicklings would be eating their usual supper of borrowed crumbs and stored berries. "It isn't fair," Mary whispered to her reflection in the glass. "They should have Christmas, too." High above, in the snug attic they called home, the Wicklings felt the change in the house as well. Their home was a cozy space, hidden behind a loose panel in the darkest corner. They used things the big people would never miss. 2 cigar boxes lined with velvet for beds. One for Beatrix and Sidney, a smaller one for the twins. Stanley slept in an old wooden pencil case, lined with stuffing from an old cushion. Poppy liked the old fur hat they had turned inside out, found in the attic when they first moved in. In their living area and kitchen, they had a metal measuring cup for a washing bowl, an old red card gift box for a table, and chairs made from wooden cotton reels with matchstick backs. Pictures cut from magazines hung on the walls like paintings. By the light of a single precious candle, Sidney mended a tiny fishing hook, ready for minnow fishing in the spring. Beatrix stirred a thin soup made from a dried pea and a piece of parsley leaf over a safe, enclosed little stove they had built from a discarded watch case. The twins played a quiet game of knucklebones with tiny, cleaned-up knucklebones. Poppy sat on a high shelf near a crack in the chimney breast, eyes closed, nose lifted. She sniffed. "Can you smell that?" she breathed. Stanley, practicing a tricky knot with a piece of thread, sniffed too. "Smell what?" "Everything," Poppy said, opening her eyes. "Sweetness and fire and fruit, all mixed together. It's coming right up the chimney." Beatrix paused her stirring and smiled. "That's the big people's Christmas, my dear. They are cooking their special feast." "A feast?" asked Mindy, leaving the game. "What's in a feast?" "Oh, all sorts of grand things," said Sidney, setting down the hook. "A great, golden brown turkey as big as a whole room to them. Mountains of potatoes. And for pudding." He closed his eyes, remembering. A dark, sticky, sweet pudding, full of plump currants and shiny peel, that they set on fire with brandy. The twins gasped. "On purpose?" Mandy whispered, wide-eyed. "On purpose," Sidney said. "It's a splendid sight." Poppy let out a long, wistful sigh. "I wish we could see it. What does it taste like?" "It tastes like joy," Beatrix said softly, "but it is a joy for big people, in their big world. Our joy is here, safe and warm together. Just then, a soft, familiar scratching came from the base of the wall. The signal. Mary was coming. Poppy scrambled down as Stanley slid back a hidden panel. A moment later, Mary's face appeared in the opening, cheeks pink from the cold of the unused attic. She crawled inside, bringing with her the faint, wonderful scent of spices clinging to her clothes. "Hello, everyone," she whispered happily. "Hello, Mary," the Wicklings chorused. Mary folded herself small on the floor. She saw the simple pot of soup, the quiet game, and the faraway, dreaming look still in Poppy's eyes. Her sad thought from the window returned. "You were talking about the smells, weren't you?" Mary asked gently. Poppy nodded. "Father and Mother were telling us about the Christmas pudding." An idea shot into Mary's mind, bright as a shooting star. It was grand and a little wild and very wonderful. Her eyes widened. A slow, sure smile spread across her face. "Poppy," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. "What if you didn't just have to smell it? What if you didn't only hear about it?" She looked around at all their tiny, hopeful faces. "What if you could have a Christmas feast of your very own?" Silence fell in the attic. Only the faraway crackle of the kitchen fire drifted up the chimney. The Wicklings stared at Mary, their faces caught between disbelief and growing hope. Mary's idea was no longer just a thought. It was a promise, one that would need a very clever plan. Chapter 2. The Feast of 1,000 Crumbs. A stunned silence followed Mary's question. It was so quiet she could hear the tiny, quick beating of the Wicklings' hearts. 6 pairs of wide eyes stared at her, shining in the candlelight like little moons. Mindy was the first to speak. "Our own feast?" she whispered, as if a loud voice might make the idea vanish. "A real one?" Mandy finished, clutching her sister's arm. Poppy's wistful sigh turned into a gasp of pure delight. Stanley stopped fiddling with his knot, his face bright with the thrill of a challenge. But the grown-ups looked the most thoughtful. Sydney and Beatrix shared a long, silent glance, a look full of years of care, of staying hidden, of knowing the dangers of the big world. Beatrix spoke first, gentle but practical. "Oh, Mary, what a kind, beautiful thought. But a feast. For us. The dangers." She shook her head. "The kitchen is the most dangerous place in the house. There's cook, with sharp eyes and quick hands. There's the kitchen maid, always scrubbing and sweeping. And worst of all, there's—" "Pepper," Stanley said. The name hung in the air like a dark cloud, the mottled gray cat who thought a flicker of Wickling shadow was the best toy in the world. Sydney nodded, laying a comforting hand on Beatrix's shoulder. "Mother is right, sorry, Mary. It's a lovely dream, but the risk is too great. A crumb from your pocket is a fine treat for us. We are happy with that." Mary's determined smile didn't fade. She had expected this. She knew they had to be careful. But she had been thinking. "I know it's dangerous," she said, leaning forward. "I'm banned from the kitchen. Cook won't have children in there. And since Sebastian and I broke a pane of glass in the greenhouse last summer when we were playing ball, she's still cross. But what if we didn't go into the kitchen when anyone was there? What if we didn't just take a crumb, but gathered our feast piece by piece? Like explorers?" Stanley's eyes lit up. "Explorers?" He sat up straighter. "Yes," Mary said, words tumbling out. "We wouldn't only get the pudding. We could get everything. A potato from the cellar. It's dark and quiet down there. A carrot, 2 or 3 sprouts, and a pea pod or 2 from the garden when the gardener's gone. Not one big dangerous trip. Lots of little clever missions." She painted the picture, and the Wicklings began to see it, not as an impossible danger, but as a string of exciting adventures. The twins bounced on their heels, already imagining a secret run to the garden. Stanley was thinking how to lower a potato into a sack. Poppy looked from Mary's hopeful face to her parents' worried ones. "We are very clever," she said softly but surely, "and we know the house better than the big people do. We know all the secret ways inside the walls." Beatrix studied her children's eager faces. She saw not recklessness, but bravery and bright ideas. She sighed, but this time it was a sigh of giving in to a wonderful, mad idea. "Little missions," she repeated, a thoughtful glint in her eye. "A potato from the cellar, that is possible. The cellar is often empty, and I could make a lovely mash with a little butter." Sydney heard the change in her voice and chuckled, warm and low. "Well," he said, rubbing his chin, "put like that, it sounds less like a foolish risk and more like A campaign. A Christmas campaign. Yes, Mary clapped softly. The Christmas campaign. We can make a plan. A map. The attic changed at once. The wistful feeling was gone, and a bright buzz filled the air. The impossible dream was turning into a possible project. The first thing we need, said Stanley, taking charge, is information. We need to know where everything is. The lay of the land. I can help, Mary said, mind racing. I can watch from the doorway. I can see where Cook puts everything. I'll draw you a map, a big one, with all the dangers marked. A map of risky plenty, Sydney said, grinning. I like it. For the next hour, happy, whispered plans filled the attic. They weren't only thinking about food now. They were thinking about a plan, about teamwork, about using all their secret knowledge of Pomfret Hall. The fear was still there, a small whisper at the back of their minds, but it was drowned out by laughter and the joy of a shared secret. Mary left as quietly as she had come, her heart soaring. She wouldn't just give her friends a few crumbs. She was going to give them an adventure. And as she crept back down to the main house, the smell of Christmas spices seemed to promise that this would be the very best Christmas any Wickling had ever known. Chapter 3. The Map of Perilous Plenty. The next day, Mary found it terribly hard to sit still. During lessons with her governess, Miss Primble, her mind kept slipping away from French verbs and her embroidery sampler. Instead of stitching a neat flower, she was picturing a tiny, brave Wickling army moving through a land of giant table legs and crumb mountains. Mary, your attention, please, said Miss Primble, her voice as sharp as her needle. A young lady must learn patience and precision. Yes, Miss Primble, Mary said, trying to look patient and precise. But inside, she fizzed with excitement. She had a mission far more important than embroidery. Her chance came after lunch. Lord and Lady Pomfret were busy with estate matters. Sebastian was, as usual, resting his eyes in the library, and Julian was out complaining about something in the village. The coast was clear. Mary said she was going to the drawing room to read, which was not quite untrue. She was going to observe, just not a book. She settled into a large, high-backed armchair by the fire, a book of poetry open on her lap. But her eyes stayed on the door to the servants' quarters, and, most of all, the kitchen. She had brought small secret supplies, a piece of parchment from her father's study, and a charcoal pencil. Hidden by the chair's wing, she began her work. All afternoon, the kitchen door swung open and shut, a busy hinge on a busy world. Each time it opened, a wave of warm air and delicious noise rolled into the hall. Mary watched, listened, and sketched. First, she drew a great sweeping rectangle for the kitchen itself. It was vast, a cave of flagstones and firelight. She marked the giant fireplace where a haunch of meat turned on a spit, juices sizzling. She drew the massive, scarred wooden table in the center, the heart of everything. Then she noted the people. Cook, Mrs. Dotty, was a mountain of a woman with a red face and a voice that rose over the clatter of pots. She ruled the kitchen like a queen, pointing and calling orders. Mary made a little sketch of her by the stove and labeled it the General. The kitchen maid, a skinny girl named Ellie, scurried like a frightened mouse, always scrubbing or fetching. Mary marked her usual path from the sink to the pantry. Ellie was less a danger than a moving obstacle. Then came the greatest threat of all, Pepper. The gray cat had lazy habits but lightning-fast paws. Most of the time he napped on a cushioned chair in the corner, soaking up the heat from the fire. Mary drew the chair and wrote Pepper's throne. But every so often he would stretch, yawn, and patrol the room, tail twitching, eyes scanning the floor for anything that moved. Now for the treasures. Mary's pencil flew. She saw the larder door, heavy and dark, leading to a cool room full of hanging meats, cheeses, and the all-important Christmas pudding. She put a big star on it. She saw the flour barrel, as tall as Mary herself, near the pantry. She saw the crock of butter on the cold slate shelf by the window. And she saw the door to the cellar, where potatoes and apples were stored. This door was almost always slightly ajar. She added careful notes. Cellar door, often open, dark and quiet. Next to Pepper's throne, she wrote, Danger, sleeping lion. By the larder, she wrote, Locked, key on hook by door. It felt like drawing a pirate map, but instead of an X for the spot, there were stars for treasure and little skulls for danger. She called it her Map of Perilous Plenty. That evening, as dusk fell, Mary could hardly keep her excitement in. She slipped up to the attic, the precious parchment rolled and tucked safely inside her dress. The Wicklings gathered close as she unrolled it on their floor. To them, it was so big it covered most of their living space. They stared in awe, walking around the edges of the drawn kitchen and peering at the giant landmarks. "Goodness," breathed Beatrix, looking at the drawing of Mrs. Dotty. "She's even bigger than I imagined." Stanley was delighted. He traced the route from their secret entrance, a mouse hole behind the pantry, to the center of the room. "Look," he said, his finger darting. "If we stay close to the wall here, we're in the shadow. Then a quick dash to the leg of the table." Sidney studied the larder door. "Locked," he murmured. "A big obstacle, but not impossible for determined explorers." Poppy pointed at Pepper. "He's the real obstacle," she said solemnly. "He is," Mary agreed. "But see, he sleeps for hours. We just have to know when he's asleep and be absolutely silent." The map made the impossible seem possible. It turned the big, scary kitchen into a place they understood. The dangers were marked. The treasures were found. It was no longer a room to fear, but a land for an adventure. Sidney looked at his family's set faces, then back at Mary. "Well, Captain," he said with a smile, "you've given us the intelligence. Now it's time to plan our campaign. Where shall we begin?" All eyes turned to the map, to the star marking the dark, quiet cellar. The Christmas campaign was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Potato from the Dark Depths. The map of Perilous Plenty lay on the floor of the Wicklings' attic home, a big sheet of dangers and chances. The whole family gathered around it, their faces lit by the warm, flickering light of their candle stump. "The first mission," Sidney said, his voice low and serious. "We must secure our foundation. The potato." Stanley, who had been studying the map, pointed a tiny finger at the star marked cellar. "The cellar is the safest," he said. "It's dark, it's quiet, and the big people only go down once or twice a day. And," added Poppy, her eyes bright, "we don't even have to go across the kitchen floor. We can use the old grain chute tunnel. It comes out right by the potato bin." This was very important. The grain chute was a narrow, dusty tunnel, long forgotten by the big people, running from a high storage room down to the cellar. For the Wicklings, it was a secret highway. "Excellent," said Beatrix, already thinking ahead. "But a potato is heavy. We'll need a way to carry it." "Stanley and I can manage," said Sidney, puffing out his chest a little. "We'll take the hauling sled." The hauling sled was one of the Wicklings' finest inventions. It was made from the curved lid of a large pocket watch, with two smooth, polished ribs underneath for runners. A long, strong piece of wool thread was tied to the front for pulling. The next morning, gray winter light filtered through the attic dust as the expedition set off. Sidney led the way, carrying a tiny lantern made from a glass bead filled with glowing foxfire moss. Stanley followed, pulling the empty sled. Beatrix had insisted Poppy go as lookout. Her sharp eyes were helpful in the dark. They slipped behind the wall and found the grain chute's little cleaning hatch. One by one, they slid down the dusty slope and landed with soft thuds in a pile of old grain husks on the cellar floor. The cellar was enormous. The ceiling was a forest of hanging hams and bunches of dried herbs. Shelves lined the walls with jars of preserves and barrels of apples that smelled sweet and musty. The air was cool and still. From a stone in the corner came a faint, steady drip-drip of water. "Stay close to the walls," Sidney whispered, "and watch for the Mouser." The Mouser was a large, grumpy cat who patrolled the cellar. He was old and slow and liked napping on a sack of grain more than hunting, but he was still a danger. Keeping to the deepest shadows, they scurried along the wall, slipping past giant barrels until they reached the potato bin. It was a great wooden crate, taller than Sidney. The sides were too smooth to climb. "This is where we use the pin," Stanley said. He uncoiled a length of knotted wool from his shoulder. Tied to the end was a sturdy safety pin, its point gleaming in the dim light, their grappling hook. Stanley swung the pin in a careful circle and let it fly. Clink. It caught on the rough wooden lip of the bin. He tugged hard to make sure it held. "You first, Poppy," Sidney said. "Eagle eyes." Poppy nodded and climbed the knotted wool with quick, sure hands. She peeped over the edge. "It's full," she whispered. "Hundreds of them. They look like great lumpy boulders." Sydney and Stanley climbed up after her. Inside, the bin was a hillside of earthy brown potatoes. They chose a perfect medium-sized one, which was still huge to them, and began the hard work of rolling it to the edge. "Ready, steady, heave!" Sydney grunted. With one last push, the potato tipped over and landed on the cellar floor with a soft, heavy thud. That's when they heard it. A low, rumbling meow. Poppy, still on the rim, froze. "The Mauser!" she hissed. "He's coming!" From the shadows between two wine barrels, a pair of sleepy yellow eyes blinked open. The Mauser, woken from his nap, stood, stretched, and began to amble towards the sound. "Quickly!" Sydney urged. "Onto the sled!" They scrambled down the rope. Working faster than ever, they rolled and heaved the heavy potato onto the watch-lid sled. Stanley grabbed the pull rope. "Go! Go, go, go!" Sydney whispered, pushing from behind. They ran for the grain chute entrance like the sled's runners whispering over the stone floor. The Mauser, interested in the moving shapes, picked up speed, tail twitching. Poppy reached the chute first. "It's too steep to pull the sled up," she cried. "Then we push from behind," Stanley said. "We'll have to go up the main way." Leaving their secret tunnel, they veered to the cellar steps, a mountain of rough wood. It was risky, but it was their only choice. They pushed and pulled, bumping the sled up each step, their tiny muscles burning. Just as the Mauser reached the bottom step, sniffing the air where they had been, the Wicklings and their prize reached the top. They slipped through the gap under the cellar door and into the quiet, dark space between the walls, hearts pounding with fear and triumph. They had done it. They had their potato. The Christmas feast had its foundation. The first mission was a success. Chapter 5. A Sprout for Courage. The return of the potato was celebrated in the attic like a great victory. The plain brown tuber sat proudly in the middle of their home, proof of their bravery and teamwork. But there was no time to rest. The very next day, Beatrix said it was time for greens. "A feast needs something fresh," she said, checking her list. 2 Brussels sprouts and a pod of broad beans. The garden is the place. A hush fell over the attic. The garden felt a world away. It was the great outdoors, wide sky, gusty wind, and birds that might see a small, moving Wickling as a tasty snack. "I'll go," said Poppy, trying to sound braver than she felt. "No, this is a job for the twins," Sydney said gently. Mindy and Mandy looked at each other with wide eyes. This would be their first real mission, a test of their courage. "Us?" Mindy whispered. "We can do it," Mandy said with a tiny squeak of determination. Beatrix knelt in front of them. "It is a big task," she said softly. "But you are small, and that is your strength. You can hide where no one would look. You must be quick, you must be quiet, and you must stay together." Their tool was simple, a large, dried sycamore leaf saved from autumn. It was curved like a little bowl, and with a thread tied on, it could be a sled or a carrying basket. Getting to the garden was an adventure by itself. They traveled through the mouse runs under the floorboards on the ground floor and came out through a crack in the stone foundation at the back of the house. Suddenly, the world was huge. The sky was a pale gray blanket. Frosty grass blades rose like tall, green towers. "Stay close to the wall," Poppy said, guiding them at the start. She pointed across a scary spread of gravel path. "The kitchen garden is on the other side. We need to cross the stone bridge." The stone bridge was a flat rock laid over the drainage ditch. To the twins, it was a narrow path over a deep gap. Holding hands, they scurried across, the leaf sled bumping behind them. The kitchen garden was a neat grid of earthy rows. To the twins, it felt like a forest of giant leafy plants. They knew what to find. Tall, knobbly stalks where Brussels sprouts grew like tiny green cabbages up the stem. "There!" Mindy pointed. They hurried over, keeping low among the rough cabbage leaves. The sprout stalk was a mighty tree. The lowest sprouts were still high above their heads. "How do we get them?" Mandy wondered. A sudden shadow slid over them, and a loud, chattering call filled the air. A blackbird landed on the garden fence, head tilted, looking for worms. "Freeze!" Mindy hissed. They pressed into the soil and went as still as stones. The blackbird hopped down to the path, pecking. It came closer. The twins held their breath, hearts thumping. The bird's shiny black eye seemed to look right at them. Then, with a quick chirp, it flew away. They let out a shared breath. The danger had passed, but they had no time to waste. "We'll have to climb," Mandy said, eyeing the rough, hairy stem. Using the tiny bumps and ridges as holds, they climbed like little mountaineers. It was hard work, but soon they reached the lowest sprouts. Each one was nearly as big as their head. Working together, they twisted and snapped two of the smallest, tightest sprouts from the stalk. They were heavy and cool to touch. "Now for the broad beans," Mindy said. They half climbed, half slid down, and found the broad bean plants nearby. The pods hung like fat, green moons. Mandy chose a plump pod and, with a neat snap, broke it from the vine. She opened it carefully to show a row of perfect emerald green beans. 12, she counted, proud and bright. They loaded everything onto the sycamore leaf sled. The journey back was even more risky, the sled now heavy and awkward. They rested often, hiding under leaves whenever a bird called or the wind rustled the bushes too loudly. At last, they slipped back through the crack in the foundation and into the safe, warm dark of the mouse run. They tumbled into a heap, tired, happy, and a little muddy. Back in the attic, they set their prizes before Beatrix. 2 perfect Brussels sprouts and a pod of 12 broad beans. "You did it!" Poppy cried, hugging them both. Beatrix beamed. "My brave, clever girls," she said, taking the vegetables. "You have brought us the taste of the outside world." The twins glowed. They had faced the huge, scary garden and won. They had brought back sprouts and broad beans for courage, and the feast was one step closer to being real. Chapter 6. The Henhouse Hazard. With the potato safe and the greens proudly stored, the Wicklings felt their courage grow. But a proper feast, Beatrix said, needed something special, something that felt like a celebration. "An egg," she said, checking her list. "For Yorkshire puddings. It will make our feast truly grand." A fresh wave of worry swept the attic. The potato had come from the dark, quiet cellar. The vegetables were from the open but empty garden. The hen house was different. It was a world of big, feathered creatures, unpredictable and very protective of their nests. "This is not a mission for the children," Sydney said firmly. "Stanley, you will come with me. This needs strength and steady nerves." Stanley swelled with importance. This was his first truly adult task. He nodded, very serious. The hen house stood at the edge of the kitchen garden, a low wooden building that smelled of straw and feathers. At dawn, the journey there was tense and silent. The world was gray and blue with cold, and the air bit at their cheeks. Hidden by frost-white lavender bushes, Sydney and Stanley moved in quick, quiet dashes. They reached the henhouse wall and found a gap between 2 warped boards, just wide enough to slip through. Inside, it was dim and warm. Soft clucking filled the air. Dust motes danced in the thin stripes of early light. "We need a pullet's egg," Sydney whispered, eyes scanning the rows of straw-filled boxes. "A small one from a young hen. Easier for us to handle." Keeping to the wall's deep shadow, they crept along. Up close, the hens were enormous, feathers fluffed, heads tucked under wings. To the tiny Wicklings, they looked like sleeping dragons. Suddenly, a hen on a lower perch shifted and gave a low, questioning bwook. Sydney and Stanley froze, pressing flat to the rough wood. A beady eye opened and stared into the shadows. For a long, thumping heartbeat, they didn't even breathe. Then, with a soft cluck, the hen tucked her head back and slept. "Too close," Stanley breathed. Sydney pointed. "There, in that far box." A young, speckled hen sat awake in her nest, pecking at the straw. "We need a diversion," Sydney said. He spotted a few grains of corn near the feed trough. "I'll lure her away. You get the egg." Before Stanley could speak, Sydney was off. He grabbed a grain and, with a mighty heave, tossed it so it landed with a faint tick on the other side of the hen house. The speckled hen's head shot up. She hopped off the nest with a flutter and strutted over to investigate the falling grain. "Now, Stanley," Sydney hissed. Stanley dashed across the open floor to the nesting box. The climb was steep, but he dug his fingers into the straw and scrambled up. Inside lay a perfect, small, cream-colored egg, still warm. The problem was its size. It was huge, almost as big as Stanley's chest. How could he move it? "Roll it," Sydney urged from hiding. "To the edge of the box." Stanley set his shoulder to the smooth, warm shell and pushed with all his might. The egg began to rock in the straw. He pushed again, grunting. It reached the edge and teetered, just as the speckled hen, having found the grain, started to turn back. "It's going to fall," Stanley whispered. "Let it fall," Sydney called softly. "I'll catch it." It was a wild plan, but there was no time. Stanley gave one last shove. The egg tipped over the rim. Below, Sydney stood ready, arms out, face set with pure determination. The egg dropped, thump, right into a thick pile of loose straw Sydney had quickly gathered. It sank into the cushion, safe and unbroken. At that moment, the speckled hen returned to her nest. She clucked in confusion, looking for her missing egg. "Grab it! Run!" Sydney whispered, already heaving the egg upright. Together, they rolled the precious egg across the dirt floor in a wobbly hurry toward the gap in the wall. The hen grew louder, her clucks waking the other birds. They reached the gap and shoved the egg through. It was tight, but it popped out onto the cold ground outside. Sydney and Stanley scrambled after it, hearts hammering. They didn't stop until they were hidden under the lavender bush, the egg's cool, smooth shell pressed between them. They had done it. They had faced the henhouse hazard and won. The Yorkshire puddings were secured. Stanley looked at his father, who was breathing hard but smiling. "Well done, son," Sydney puffed. "That was a close one." Stanley grinned, pride washing away the fear. They had the egg. With every daring mission, the feast was becoming real. Chapter 7. A Pocket of Flour and a Pat of Butter. The egg mission's victory filled the attic with a happy, dizzy feeling. But Beatrix, ever practical, brought them back to earth. A Yorkshire pudding is nothing without flour to hold it together, and butter to make it rich, she said, tapping her list. And these are kept in the heart of the beast, the kitchen itself. A solemn hush fell. The kitchen was the most dangerous place of all. It was Pepper's domain. Wide, echoing floors and tall, watchful giants. "This must be a night mission," Sydney said, "when the fires are banked and the giants are asleep." "And we must be like shadows," Poppy whispered. The two stealthiest Wicklings were chosen, Beatrix and Poppy. Their tools were simple but important, 2 carefully emptied acorn caps for containers, and a brave, steady heart. That night, when the moon was high and the great house was still, only the wind sighing and the hall clock ticking, they set out. They did not use the floor mouse holes. Instead, they moved through their secret wall passages and slipped out through a tiny crack in the plaster high near the kitchen ceiling. From up there, the room below looked like a vast, dark canyon. Moonlight streamed through the big window and drew silver paths on the flagstones. In the corner, on his cushioned throne, lay a shapeless gray mound, Pepper, fast asleep. Even from across the room, they could hear his soft, steady purr. "There," Beatrix breathed. The flour barrel stood like a squat tower by the pantry door. The butter crock, a smooth, pale jar, sat on a cold slate shelf by the window. Their plan was to use the safety pin grappling hook and the wool rope, lowering themselves like spiders on a thread. It was a frightening thought, dangling in the open air with the sleeping cat below. "You go first, Mother," Poppy said, eyes wide. "I'll keep watch from here." Beatrix nodded, face set and calm. She tied the wool firmly to a hidden nail head inside the crack. With the pin in one hand and the rope in the other, she began to go down, slow and careful. The world swung gently. The floor looked a mile away. Pepper's purr rolled like far-off thunder. Beatrix kept her eyes on the rough wall, inch by inch. At last her feet touched the cool stone. She was down. She hurried to the shadow of the flour barrel and signaled up. Poppy began her own descent, lighter, quicker, heart-thudding fast, and landed softly beside her mother. They went first to the butter. The lid was heavy, but together they pushed it just enough to make a small gap. A creamy, rich smell drifted out. Using a tiny wooden spatula, Beatrix scraped a generous pat of golden butter into one acorn cap. Next came the flour. Near the base of the barrel was a small knothole. Beatrix held the second acorn cap underneath, while Poppy poked inside with a little stick. A soft shower of fine white powder fell into their cup. Then disaster nearly struck. On his cushion, Pepper stirred. The purring stopped. In the moonlight, they saw him stretch, back arching, claws sliding out. He yawned wide, pink mouth, sharp white teeth. "Freeze," Beatrix breathed. Poppy went still, clutching the flour-filled cap. They pressed themselves against the cool wood of the barrel, so no melting into the shadow. Pepper stood, tail giving a lazy twitch. His green eyes swept the room. He looked right past their darkness, seeing only the night's familiar shapes. He turned in a circle twice, and then, with a soft sigh, curled down again. A moment later, The gentle rumble of his purr returned. The Wicklings let out the breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The climb back was a quiet, urgent scramble up the wool rope, the precious acorn caps clutched tight. They did not feel safe until the rope was pulled after them and they were back inside the snug, dark passage. In the attic, they set down their prizes. The flour was fine and white, the butter a neat, golden pat. "We did it," Poppy said, her voice shaking with leftover fright and joy. Beatrix slipped an arm around her. "We faced the lion in his den and came away with treasure," she said, pride warm in her voice. "The feast is almost complete." Only the grand prize remained now, the crown jewel of Christmas. The pudding. And they all knew it would be the greatest challenge of all. Chapter 8. The Quest for the Turkey Tail. With the flour and butter tucked safely in a cool corner of the attic, the Wicklings' larder was almost full. The potato, the sprouts and broad beans, the egg. It was a wonderful collection. But Beatrix looked it over with a careful eye. "It's a fine feast," she said, "but it's missing the centerpiece, the main event." "The turkey?" Stanley asked, doubt in his voice. The idea of getting even a scrap of that great bird seemed impossible. "Far, not the bird itself," Beatrix said with a knowing smile, "but the taste of it. I remember my own mother once told me a way. We need a very special kind of mushroom. It grows on old logs in the woods. It's called turkey tail because it has rings of color like a turkey's feathers. When it's dried and ground, it makes a broth that tastes rich and meaty, like the finest roast." A journey to the woods. This was a far bigger trip than any they had made. The woods lay at the edge of the estate, wild and unknown. "This is a mission for the whole family," Sydney declared. "We shall travel by the safest route we know, the mole tunnels." The Wicklings had a long, friendly understanding with the moles who dug the wide web of tunnels between the great houses. Their special friend was an old, wise mole named Black Nose, because the tip of his snout was as dark as coal. The next morning, the whole Wickling family set out. Sydney led with his foxfire lantern, then came Stanley, then the twins, then Poppy, and Beatrix brought up the rear. They took a small passage down to ground level and reached an earthy hole at the back of the house, a way known only to them. The tunnel sloped down, cool and dark, smelling of damp earth and roots. They walked for what felt like a long time, the tunnel bending this way and that. At last, they reached a wider chamber, a crossroads in the underground paths. And there, as if waiting, was Black Nose. "Little foot friends," rumbled the mole, his voice a soft shake in the dark. "You travel far from your warm walls." He was almost blind, but he knew them by their scent and their small, careful steps. "We seek your help, Honorable Black Nose," Sydney said, bowing his head. "We need turkey tail fungus, which grows on fallen logs. We must reach the edge of the western woods." Black Nose sniffed. "The air is cold above. The white sleep has begun." "Han," he said, "the frost. But I know the place. There is an old badger set that opens near a great oak. Many logs lie there. Follow my scent. I will guide you." With Black Nose padding ahead, claws soft on the tunnel floor, they went on. The twins, Mindy and Mandy, held hands, excited, but a little scared of the deep, echoing dark. After a while, Black Nose stopped. "Here," he said, nudging a tangle of roots. "A way up. Be watchful of the sky hunters," he warned, "the birds of prey. The turkey tail grows in shelves, like little plates on the wood. You will know it by its colors, gray, blue, brown, like a tapestry." They thanked the old mole and climbed through the rooty opening into the bright, cold light of the woods. The forest floor was a crisp carpet of brown leaves. Fallen branches were like giant trees to them. The air was sharp and clean. "Look for a fallen log," Poppy called, shading her eyes from the pale sky. Stanley found it first. "Over here," he shouted. A huge mossy oak log lay on its side, and all along it, in neat overlapping shelves, grew clusters of fungi. They were thin and bendy, banded with rings of gray, brown, and a soft, rusty red. "The turkey tail!" Beatrix cried, hurrying over. With a sharp flake of flint, she cut several large pieces from the log. The fungus was tough and flexible. As they worked, a shadow passed over them. A big crow landed on a branch high above and gave a loud caw. The Wicklings froze, clutching their mushroom prizes. The crow tilted its head, its black, clever eye seeming to look right at them. For a long, tight moment, they did not move. Then, with a flap, the crow flew off, looking for easier prizes. Hearts thumping, the Wicklings gathered their harvest and scurried back to the mole tunnel opening. Black Nose was waiting. "You have what you need, Littlefoot friends," he rumbled. "We do, thanks to you," Sydney said warmly. "We are in your debt." "The tunnels are for all friends," said the mole. "Travel safely." The journey home felt shorter. Their steps were light. They had gone into the wild and returned. Back in the attic, Beatrix spread the colorful turkey-tail mushrooms to dry by their tiny stove. "The taste of the feast," she said proudly, looking at the bright banded shelves. "We have our turkey." Their Christmas dinner was now complete, except for one final glorious piece. But the pudding heist was for another day. Today they celebrated their quest's success, feeling braver and more together than ever. Chapter 9. Sydney's Story. The Candlelit Christmas. Outside Pomfret Hall, a fierce wind howled, whistling through the cracks in the attic eaves and tossing snow against the window panes. Inside their snug home, the Wicklings were warm and safe. Colorful turkey-tail mushrooms dried by the stove, filling the air with a faint, earthy smell. The potato, the sprouts, the egg, and the other ingredients sat in neat rows, a little parade of bravery. As the storm rattled the roof, Beatrix lit an extra candle stump. "A night for a story, I think," she said, settling onto a cushion stuffed with velvet. "Yes! A story!" cried the twins, curling up at her feet. Poppy and Stanley moved closer, and even Sydney put aside the tiny harness he was mending. The candlelight danced on their faces and made the attic feel like the coziest place in the world. "Father," Poppy asked, "was there ever a Christmas when you were little that was as exciting as this one?" Sydney smiled, his eyes far away. "Exciting?" "One was certainly memorable. It was the Christmas of the Great Snow, when I was about Stanley's age. We were living then within the walls of Huntingdon Manor, a house even bigger and draughtier than this one." He leaned back, and his voice slipped into the gentle rhythm of a well-told tale. "A blizzard began on Christmas Eve, much like this, but fiercer. It snowed and snowed until the world was buried. For the big people, it was an inconvenience. For us, it was a siege. The snow blocked all our tiny entrances and the mouse runs we used for foraging. We were trapped in our little home behind the library wall." "The library," Mindy breathed. "Was it warm?" "Ah, that was the trouble," Sydney said. "Our home was warmed by the library fireplace. The big people, snowed in and with plenty of coal, kept the fire roaring day and night. At first it was wonderfully cozy, but after 2 days, the heat was too much. The wall behind us grew hot as an oven. We couldn't touch it. We were stuck between the baking wall and the frozen world outside." "What did you do?" Stanley asked, caught by the story. "We were running out of food and water," Sydney went on. "My father knew we had to risk it. On the third night, he decided we must brave the library itself to find supplies. It was the most dangerous thing we had ever done. The big people were always there, reading or talking by the fire. We crept out through a hole near the floorboards. The library was a vast desert of carpet with towering cliffs of bookshelves. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, glittering in the firelight, and on a small table right in the middle lay a single half-eaten mince pie. "The Great Pie Heist!" Mandy whispered, thrilled. "It was," Sydney said, chuckling. "My father made a diversion. He knocked a small, dried berry from the hearth, so it rolled across the floor. The family's dog, a great slobbering beast, bounded after it. While they laughed at the dog, my mother and I scurried to the table leg. We climbed the carved wood like sailors up a mast and reached the plate." He paused. The pie was still warm. The smell was heavenly. We couldn't take the whole thing, of course, but with a sharpened sliver of wood, we cut out a huge lump of the filling, the sticky, sweet fruit and spices, and pushed it over the edge, it landed with a soft plop on the carpet below. My sister was waiting with a cloth to bundle it up. We escaped back to our home, hearts pounding, but with enough food to last until the snow melted. That little piece of mince pie was our whole Christmas feast. We ate it by candlelight, listening to the wind howl. We were together, and we were safe. It tasted of more than fruit and spice. It tasted of courage and family, and the joy of being warm when the world is cold. He finished, and the attic was quiet except for the wind. The Wicklings looked at their own hard-won ingredients with new respect. "It's not just about the food, is it, Father?" Poppy said softly. Sydney smiled and shook his head. No, my dear, it's about the adventure of getting it and the love with which it's shared. That's the real feast. The storm outside didn't seem so frightening now. Inside, with their treasures and each other, the Wicklings felt richer than any king. Chapter 10. The Shadow of the Grand Ball. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Pomfret Hall tucked under a thick, quiet blanket of snow. Inside, winter's hush was swapped for bustle and sparkle. The biggest event of Christmas was almost here, the grand Christmas Eve ball. Mary tried to enjoy the excitement, but her thoughts kept drifting upstairs. While her mother, Lady Pomfret, hurried from room to room with lists and servants carried chairs and polished silver, Mary kept thinking of the attic. The Wicklings' final and most dangerous mission, the Christmas pudding heist, was set for that very night during the ball. The noise and fuss would be perfect cover, but all the extra people also meant more risk. Wanting a calm moment, Mary slipped into the drawing room. Her mother was there, carefully setting holly and ivy along the mantelpiece. "It will be so beautiful, Mama," Mary said, admiring the shining decorations. "It must be perfect, my dear," Lady Pomfret said, a little breathless but smiling. Her eyes fell on Mary's simple dress. "And you must look perfect, too. I have just the thing." She hurried to a small inlaid wooden box on her desk. With a tiny key, she opened it and lifted out a little treasure that caught the firelight. "This," she said softly, "was my mother's. I wore it to my first Christmas ball, and I should like you to wear it tonight." It was a locket, delicate and golden, no bigger than Mary's thumbnail. It was an oval, neatly etched with a swirling pattern. It hung from a fine chain and held a single deep red gemstone in the center. "Oh, Mama!" Mary breathed. "It's beautiful." "It is," Lady Pomfret agreed, fastening it gently around Mary's neck. The locket lay cool against her skin. "It is very old and very precious. It is our little secret heirloom. Promise me you will take the very best care of it." Mary touched the smooth gold. "I promise," she whispered. Her heart swelled with love and with a new, heavy sense of duty. The locket was a sign of her mother's trust. It also reminded her she was living in two worlds. Down here, she was a young lady trusted with a family treasure. Upstairs, she was a helper in a daring food heist. Later, when she climbed to the attic, the locket felt like a bright beacon under her dress. "It's happening tonight," she told the Wicklings in a hush. "The ball. It will be the best time for the pudding." The Wicklings listened closely, their small faces serious. They showed her their last preparations, the reinforced basket for the pudding, the strongest wool rope, and the safety pin grappling hook sharpened to a fine point. "We are ready, Mary," Sidney said, steady and sure. As Mary turned to go, she couldn't help herself. She lifted the locket from her collar so it caught their candlelight. "My mother gave it to me to wear tonight," she said. "It was her mother's. She said it's a secret heirloom." The Wicklings gathered round, their eyes shining at the glow of the gold and the red gem. To them it was a wonder, a human treasure that was both beautiful and full of meaning. "It is like our feast," Poppy said thoughtfully. "A secret treasure, passed down with love." Mary nodded and tucked the locket safely away. The words secret and treasure echoed in her mind. She felt very close to her tiny friends. They were all guarding precious, hidden things. But as she went back downstairs to get ready for the ball, she did not know that the two worlds, the glittering world of the ball and the hidden world of the Wicklings, were about to collide in a way she could never have imagined. Chapter 11. A Panic in the Parlor. The grand Christmas Eve ball was just as Mary had dreamed. Pomfret Hall glowed with 1,000 candles. Laughter and music filled the air from the quartet in the corner. Ladies in silk gowns swirled like bright flowers, and gentlemen in fine waistcoats bowed and chatted. In her best dress and wearing the precious locket, Mary felt like a princess in a fairy tale. She was dancing a simple quadrille with a boy her own age when she saw her mother across the room, waving for her to come. Lady Pomfret introduced Mary to her friends, then kept talking, hands moving as she told a story. As she gestured, one hand brushed the delicate chain of Mary's locket. Mary had been showing it to the boy. It happened in an instant. A tiny, almost silent ping. The fragile old chain, tugged by all the movement, snapped. Time seemed to slow. Mary watched, horrified, as the golden locket with its single red gem slipped from her neck. It fell, turning end over end, a little spark in the candlelight, and landed on the edge of the Persian rug on the parlor floor. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, it rolled. It didn't stop. It reached a narrow gap between the floorboards, a dark crack that had been there for 100 years, and with one last faint glint, the locket vanished. Lady Pomfret's hand flew to her throat. Her laughter stopped. The joy went from her face. "My locket!" she cried, her voice cutting through the music. The quartet stumbled to a halt. Conversations broke off. Everyone looked as Lady Pomfret knelt on the rug, fingers searching the gap in the boards. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's fallen through. It's lost." Lord Pomfret hurried to her side. There, my dear," he said, patting her hand. "We'll have a servant pry up the board in the morning." "But it will be damaged," she wailed, "or it will be lost forever in the dirt and the dark. Oh, it's hopeless." Mary stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, her heart thudding. The music started again, but the magic of the party had vanished for her. She saw the real grief in her mother's face. The secret heirloom, trusted to her just hours before, was gone. It was a disaster. Then a wild, impossible idea rose in Mary's mind. The floorboards, the dark space beneath, a place where big people could never go, a place that was home to her other family. The pudding heist, the grand finish to the Christmas campaign, fell from her thoughts. A new, more urgent mission had taken its place. The ball whirled on, a blur of color and sound, but Mary was already planning. She had to get to the attic, at once. Chapter 12. A Promise and a Puzzle. The joyful music of the ball now sounded almost mocking to Mary. Each note seemed to underline her mother's distress. She watched as her father led a very upset Lady Pomfret from the parlor, their leaving casting a shadow over the celebration. The locket was more than jewelry. It was a piece of her mother's heart, a link to a past Mary had only heard about in stories. And it was gone, lost in the dark, dusty space under the floor. Guilt, cold and heavy, settled in Mary's stomach. Her mother had trusted her with the locket, and even though the break wasn't really her fault, she felt responsible. But beneath the guilt, a small spark of hope flickered. A wild, desperate, wonderful hope. She had to get to the attic. Slipping away from the dance floor was easier than she expected. Everyone was busy talking about the lost heirloom. Gathering the skirts of her party dress, she hurried as fast as she dared, first up the grand staircase, then along the narrower, colder servants' stairs to the empty west wing. The sounds of the ball faded behind her, replaced by the quiet of the unused rooms and the quick, frightened beat of her own heart. She didn't use the Wicklings' usual soft signal. She scrambled up the final ladder and pushed open the loose panel, her breath puffing white in the freezing air. The Wicklings were in the last steps of their heist plans. Stanley was testing the strong wool rope, while Sydney and Beatrix checked the kitchen map one more time. They looked up in surprise at Mary's sudden, flushed arrival. "Mary," Poppy cried. "What's wrong? The ball has only just started." "There's been a change of plans," Mary gasped, sinking to her knees. "Something terrible has happened. And you might be the only ones in the whole world who can help." In a rushed whisper, she told them everything. The beautiful locket, the broken chain, the awful moment it slipped between the floorboards. She described her mother's shock and how the big people could not reach it without tearing up the floor. "It's gone forever, unless..." Mary looked from face to tiny face, her eyes pleading. "Unless you can find it. You can go where no one else can. You know the world under the floors." Silence filled the attic. The Christmas pudding heist, once the boldest plan of all, suddenly seemed smaller. This was different. This wasn't about food or feasting. This was about heartbreak. This was about helping Mary, their friend and protector, when she needed them most. Sydney and Beatrix shared a grave look. The space beneath the parlor floor was not like the cellar or the walls. It was a no man's land, a place the most dangerous house creatures used, the rats. Stanley spoke first, his voice firm with courage. "We can find it," he said, jaw set. "We have to." Poppy nodded hard. "Of course we'll help, Mary. We'll find your mother's treasure." Sydney took a long breath. He looked at Mary's hopeful face, then at his family's determined ones. The Christmas campaign had taken an unexpected turn. "The pudding can wait," he said, steady and clear. "A friend's need comes first. but this path is more dangerous. The Rat's Run is not a place we travel lightly." He turned to Stanley and Poppy. "This will be for our bravest and our cleverest. Stanley, Poppy, you will lead the search. You know the underfloor paths best." Mary's eyes filled with tears of thanks and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "But be so careful. The rats." "We know," Poppy said, pale but sure. "We'll be like shadows. We'll find the locket, Mary. We promise." The kitchen map was rolled up and set aside. A new, urgent map formed in their minds. A map of the dark maze beneath the parlor, where a tiny piece of gold and a promise waited. The fate of the Christmas feast now hung on a rescue mission far more precious than any pudding. Chapter 13. Into the Underfloor Labyrinth. The air in the attic felt different now, tight and serious. The cozy buzz of feast-making had gone, and in its place was the quiet focus of a rescue. Stanley and Poppy stood ready, faces set. They had swapped their usual soft shoes for tougher ones made from dried mouse skin, good for gripping rough wood. Each carried a small, sharpened sliver of metal, a needle for Stanley, a pin for Poppy, not for fighting, but for using as tools. Sidney rested a hand on each of their shoulders. "Remember," he said, low and steady, "you are not going to fight. You are going to find. You are eyes and whispers, not teeth and claws. If you see a rat, you hide. Do not engage. The locket is precious, but you are more precious to us." Beatrix gave them their most important tool, a tiny lantern. It was a hollowed pebble with a thin, see-through skin stretched across it for a window. Inside, a few specks of glowing foxfire moss gave off a soft, green light, just enough to see a little way ahead without shining too brightly. "The light is for finding, not for traveling," Beatrix said. "Use it sparingly. Let your ears and hands guide you." She touched their cheeks, worry bright in her eyes. "Come back to us." Mary swallowed hard. "It fell right by the big fireplace," she whispered, showing the exact spot on the parlor rug. "It's a dark red gem in a gold oval." With final, firm nods, Stanley and Poppy slipped through a hidden crack in the attic floor that led not down the walls, but straight into the wide space between the parlor ceiling and the upstairs floor, the top level of the underfloor maze. The world changed at once. The air was cold and dry and tasted of old dust and wood. The faint music from the ball and the ticking clock faded away. In their place was a deep, heavy quiet, broken only by the odd creak from a floorboard high above. Around them stood giant, rough beams, with cobwebs hanging like gray curtains. Stanley went first, moving with careful silence. They felt their way by touch and memory, taking paths they knew from safer days. To reach the parlor, they had to go lower. They found a narrow gap where a water pipe dropped through the house and slid down it, backs pressed to the cool plaster. At last they came to the space beneath the dance floor. It was a wide, dark crawl space. The boards above were like a solid ceiling. The ground below was packed hard. The smell here was different, damp and stale, with a faint, unpleasant musk. Stanley raised a hand. He listened. From the dark ahead came a faint, scratchy skitter. Then another. Rats. Poppy's hand grabbed Stanley's arm. He gave a slow, steady squeeze back. This was why they had come. He pointed to a narrow beam that ran the length of the room. They moved along it instead of the ground, keeping above the main path. Stanley risked the quickest flicker of lantern light, holding it close to block the glow. The greenish shine showed a small patch below, droppings like dark, swollen grains of rice, a gnawed chicken bone, a rat's treasure, but no locket. They crept on, inch by inch. Dust tickled their noses. The beam was splintery and rough. Poppy's sharp eyes searched the shadows below for a glint of gold or a tiny spark of deep red. The skittering seemed to come from everywhere, sometimes near, sometimes far. Their hearts thudded fast in the heavy quiet. Poppy stopped. She tugged Stanley's sleeve and pointed down to the left. There, in a small dip in the earth beside one of the great stone feet of the fireplace, something glimmered. A soft golden gleam, and in its center, a single point of dark red. The locket. But it wasn't alone. Curled asleep beside it, tail wrapped around its body, lay a large young rat. The locket rested right by its head, like a shiny prize it had found, and then dozed off guarding. They had found the treasure. Now came the most dangerous part, taking it back from the dragon's lair. Chapter 14. The Ghost of the Locket. Stanley and Poppy crouched on the dusty beam, staring down at the sleeping rat and the glint of gold. The creature's sides rose and fell, its whiskers twitching in a rat-like dream. The locket was so close, yet it might as well have been on the moon. Poppy leaned close to Stanley's ear, her breath a thread of sound. "We can't fight it." Stanley shook his head, eyes fixed on the rat. "We don't have to. We need a distraction, something to make it move away for a moment." He searched the dark with quick, careful glances. Then he saw the gnawed chicken bone they had passed a few feet back. It was risky. A moving bone might draw the rat too fast, or call others. But it was their only chance. He pointed to the bone, then to a spot farther down the crawlspace, away from the locket. Poppy nodded, pale but steady. Stanley slid along the beam like a shadow, fetched the bone, and crept back. He took a breath and tossed it. The bone arced through the air and landed with a soft, dry clatter several feet away. The effect was instant. The young rat jerked awake. Its head shot up, nose twitching hard. It uncurled, sniffed, and with a greedy squeak scurried toward the sound. Its treasure was forgotten. "Now," Stanley hissed. This was Poppy's moment. She was lighter and quicker. She climbed down from the beam, using the rough stones of the fireplace footing like a ladder. Her heart banged in her chest. The rat smell was strong here. She reached the hollow where it had slept. The locket lay there, cool and smooth, heavier than she expected. She grabbed it with both hands. A loud, chattering squeal rang out from the dark. The young rat had been challenged for its bone by a larger, bossier rat. The quarrel was growing fast. "Poppy, hurry!" Stanley urged from above, fear tight in his voice. Poppy didn't wait. Clutching the locket to her chest, she scrambled up the stones. Her foot slipped on loose mortar. She gasped, but Stanley caught her arm and hauled her onto the beam. Below them, the rat fight flared, a snarling, screeching racket that echoed through the underfloor. It was the perfect cover. They didn't look back. They ran the beam, climbed the water pipe, and threaded through the forest of joists, then tumbled, panting and shaking, into the safe back, familiar dark of their own attic wall. Down on the dance floor, the ball was winding down. Guests were leaving, laughing and loud. Lady Pomfret had returned, trying to be brave, but her eyes were red and she kept glancing at the gap between the floorboards. Mary stood beside her, a knot of worry in her middle. Had the Wicklings done it? Were they safe? Every minute felt endless. Then she saw it. A tiny stir near the fringe of the big Persian rug by the fireplace. A small, careful nudge. A glint of gold and red slid up from under the thick fringe, until it lay half hidden in the weave. Mary's breath caught. She had to act naturally. She must not give away the secret. "Oh, Mama!" she cried, making her voice sound surprised. She tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mama, look, the rug fringe. I think the locket might have caught when it fell." Lady Pomfret turned, doubtful and tired, but she followed Mary's finger. Her eyes flew wide. She rushed over and knelt, hands trembling as she parted the thick threads. There it was, the golden locket, perfect and whole, as if it had been there all along. Oh, my goodness," Lady Pomfret cried, pressing it to her chest. Tears of joy ran down her face. "It was here. It was never lost. It must have bounced and caught in the fringe. Oh, Mary, you clever, clever girl." She hugged Mary tight, the cold metal pressed between them. Over her mother's shoulder, Mary glanced toward the corner where a tiny, almost hidden crack ran along the skirting board. She allowed herself a small, secret smile. The ghost of the locket had returned, thanks to the bravest friends a girl could have. The heirloom was safe, and so were her Wicklings. Now, at last, it was time for the final act of the Christmas campaign. Chapter 15. The Eve of the Heist. Relief warmed Mary like the parlor fire. With her mother's locket safely back and the guests finally gone, the grand house sank into a calm after-party quiet. But as Mary climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her thoughts raced ahead. The rescue had been a great success, yet the first goal still remained. The Christmas pudding was waiting. Later, as the moon rose over the snow-blanketed estate, Mary made her last silent trip to the attic. She found the Wicklings busy and calm, turning the fear of the underfloor adventure into fresh purpose. "You were so brave," Mary whispered as she slipped inside, looking from Poppy's steady face to Stanley's proud one. "I can never thank you enough." "It was nothing a good Wickling wouldn't do for a friend," Stanley said, though his chest lifted just a little. "The locket is safe," Poppy added with a smile. "Now we finish what we started." The map of Perilous Plenty was unrolled again, now covered in tiny new notes in charcoal. With his arm around Beatrix, Sidney pointed to the drawing of the kitchen table. "The trouble with the locket turned out to be a blessing in disguise," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Everyone is tired from the ball. The servants will clean quickly and go to bed. Cook will be worn out. They will all sleep deeply tonight." "And Pepper?" Mary asked, her eyes flicking to the drawing of the gray cat on his cushioned throne. "He stuffed himself on party scraps," Beatrix said with a knowing nod. "He'll be lazy and full. It is the perfect time." The final tools were set out. The main one was the basket for the pudding. It was a little masterpiece, a stiff, curved leaf for the base, strengthened with thread, sides woven from strong, bendy grasses, and a soft scrap of white cloth inside to cradle the prize. Beside it lay their lifeline, the long, strong wool rope, its knots checked again and again, and, shining last of all, the key to the whole plan, the large safety pin, its point sharpened bright. It would be their grappling hook, their climber, their prying tool. "Our plan is simple," Stanley said, tracing a route on the map. "We enter from the highway, through the crack in the ceiling. We lower ourselves to the table. We fix the basket under the pudding bowl. Then we work quickly and quietly." "Remember," Sidney told his family, "speed is safety. Silence is our shield. We take only what we need, a taste of the feast, not the feast itself. This is for sharing, not greed." One by one, they checked their things. Poppy made sure the foxfire lantern was ready, the soft green glow their only light. The twins, Mindy and Mandy, though not joining the mission, had braided neat, strong cords for everyone to tie back their sleeves so nothing would snag. Beatrix looked at them all, worry and pride mixing on her face. "This is for us," she said softly, "for our Christmas. When you feel afraid, think of the feast we will share." A quiet, excited buzz filled the attic. The hard-won ingredients, the potato, the sprouts, the egg, the flour and butter, the turkey tail mushroom, sat in a neat line, waiting for their king. The final shining piece was almost theirs. Mary looked at their small, serious faces in the candlelight. They were no longer only her secret friends. They were explorers, little heroes. "This is it," Mary whispered, full of awe. The Great Christmas Heist. Outside, the world lay still and frozen. Inside the attic of Pomfret Hall, 6 tiny hearts beat fast with the warm thrum of adventure. The eve of the heist was over. The night of the heist had begun. Chapter 16. The Kitchen at Midnight. The trip to the kitchen was a silent, shadowy procession. The Wicklings moved like whispers through the walls, the faintest scuff of a foot on wood, the soft rustle of their rope against plaster. Stanley led, every sense sharp. Sidney followed close. Then came Poppy, in charge of the lantern and the precious empty basket. Beatrix and the twins stayed in the attic to keep the home fire burning and wait for their return. They reached their entry point, a hairline crack in the kitchen ceiling, high in a dark corner far above the flagstones. A tiny trapdoor, hinged by the ceiling paper and held fast with the strongest threads. Stanley peered down. Below, the moonlight turned the kitchen into a silver and shadow land. Bright shafts poured through the big window, picking out the giant table, the cold black eye of the fireplace, and the still, tall shapes of cabinets and barrels. On the cushioned chair in the corner, a soft gray mound rose and fell with sleepy breaths. Pepper was a quiet hill of fur. Stanley clicked his tongue softly. All clear. Time to begin. He tied the wool rope to a solid nailhead hidden in the crack and tugged with all his weight. It held. Holding the safety pin grappling hook in one hand and the rope in the other, he lowered himself into open air. This was the scariest part, hanging in the middle of the huge room with only a thread of wool between him and the hard floor. The rope turned slowly, giving him a full view of the sleeping kitchen. He fixed his eyes on the thick leg of the big table, swung gently until his feet met the carved wood, scrambled onto it, and gave 2 quick, soft tugs on the rope. Safe. They came down one by one. Sidney next, slower but sure. Then Poppy. She had the trickiest job, climbing with one hand while the other held the folded basket, but she was nimble. In moments, all 3 stood together on the table leg. The tabletop was its own world. A wide, dark plain of scarred wood, still smelling faintly of flour and yeast. And there, in the very center, stood their goal, the Christmas pudding. It was grand. Under a great glass dome, like a king beneath a crystal crown, the pudding sat dark as rich earth, studded with shining fruit that caught the moonlight. To the Wicklings, it was a small hill, a monument to Christmas. They hurried over the wood, feet silent. Up close, the spices were strong: cinnamon, nutmeg, and something deeper, like brandy. "This is it," Stanley breathed. Now came the hardest part, getting a piece. Sydney and Stanley set their shoulders to the glass dome. It was heavy, but together they lifted it the tiniest bit. Poppy slid a wooden wedge, a saved matchstick, into the gap. They shifted, pushed again, and slid in another. Bit by bit, with quiet grunts, they made just enough space for Stanley to wriggle under. Inside the dome, the sweet smell wrapped around him. Stanley stood beside the pudding, a tiny figure next to a delicious mountain. He took out his sharpened metal needle and began to dig carefully, scooping a generous piece packed with currants and candied peel. He passed the rich, sticky handful to Poppy, who set it gently into the cloth-lined basket. It was working. They were doing it. The kitchen was silent, except for the steady sound of Pepper's breathing in the corner. The Great Christmas Heist was moments from success. Then the sound changed. The deep, rumbling purr stopped. In the moonlit quiet, that sudden silence was as loud as a thunderclap. Chapter 17. The Ascent of Pudding Mountain. The sudden silence was scarier than any sound. Inside the glass dome, Stanley froze, his hand still holding a sticky bit of candied peel. Outside, Sydney and Poppy, who were lifting the dome, went as still as statues. Poppy, with her back to the room, couldn't see, but Sydney could. His wide eyes stared at the cushioned chair in the corner. Pepper had woken up. The gray cat lifted his head, his ears pricked forward, swiveling like little dishes catching a faint sound. A low, curious meow rumbled in his chest. He had heard something. The faint scrape of the dome? The whisper of their breathing? They couldn't tell. Sydney held his breath, arms shaking from the weight of the glass. He begged the cat in his head. "Go back to sleep. Close your eyes." It was nothing. Just a dream. Pepper's shining green eyes swept the dark kitchen. They passed over the table, seeing only the usual shapes in the moonlight. He blinked slowly. Then he stood up. Every muscle in Sydney's body tightened. Poppy felt his fear and dared a tiny look over her shoulder. She saw the cat stretch back high, front paws long, claws sliding out and sinking into the cushion. It was a lazy wake-up, but to the tiny Wicklings it was the move of a giant. Pepper hopped down with a soft thud. His thick gray tail gave a lazy twitch. He wasn't hunting, he was sniffing. Nose to the floor, he patted over the flagstones, following some tasty smell left from the night's feast. He was moving away from the table. Sydney let out a slow, silent breath. The first danger had passed, but a new one had begun. The cat was awake and walking. They were trapped up on the tabletop. Stanley, still inside the dome, read the danger in their frozen faces. He had to be quicker. He scraped and scooped faster, filling the little basket as fast as he could. Rich, sticky pudding, currants and candied peel came away in soft chunks. "Enough," Sydney whispered, his voice a thread. "It's enough. We must go. Now." Stanley gave a sharp nod. He passed the last handful to Poppy, who packed it into the now brimming basket. The smell was thick and sweet, like a cloud of Christmas. Stanley wriggled back out from under the dome. Together, he and Sydney eased the heavy glass down, sliding the tiny wedges out one by one until it settled with a soft, final thunk. The pudding mountain sat sealed again beneath its crystal crown, a small bite missing from its side. The heist was complete. They had the prize. But the most dangerous part was just beginning. The escape. Pepper was somewhere below, a gray ghost in the moonlight. They had to cross the wide, bare tabletop, climb down the leg and reach the rope and ceiling crack without being seen. Stanley lifted the basket. It felt satisfyingly heavy. He looked at his father and sister, their faces pale but steady in the silver light. "The slow and silent way," Sydney mouthed, pointing to the table's edge. Hunched low, the pudding basket held tight between them. The three Wicklings began their careful journey back across the great dark plain of the table, while a waking cat prowled the shadows below. Chapter 18. A Pinch of Peril. The walk back across the tabletop felt 1,000 times longer than the way out. Every little splinter seemed to catch at their feet. The basket, light when empty, was now a heavy, delicious load. Stanley and Sydney had to carry it together, shuffling in a crouch. Poppy led, eyes on the big, carved table leg, ears straining for any sound below. She heard it first, a soft pad on the flagstones. Then a faint sniff. She froze and lifted a hand. The others stopped at once, as still as the wood. Pepper was right beneath them. The gray cat had finished checking the floor. Finding nothing fun there, he looked up. The table was a place of many delights. He jumped onto a chair and, with a smooth, silent spring, landed on the tabletop. The Wicklings were caught in the open. The leg was still several feet away. There was nowhere to hide. Pepper's landing sent a tiny tremor through the table. He stood, tail swishing slowly, head turning. He hadn't seen them yet. Their dull, earth-colored clothes blended with the shadows and the wood grain. But the smell, that was different. His nose twitched. He stepped toward the middle of the table, toward the pudding. He followed the rich, fruity scent left hanging in the air from their heist. He passed within inches of them. They felt the air move with his body and caught the faint scent of dust and cat. Poppy squeezed her eyes shut, wishing to be invisible. Sydney held his breath, muscles burning as he kept his end of the basket steady. Pepper reached the glass dome. He nudged it with his nose. The crystal gave a soft clink. He circled once, then, deciding it wasn't interesting, turned away. As he turned, his long, bushy tail swept across the tabletop. It was careless and lazy, but to the Wicklings, it was a gray wave. The tail tip flicked straight toward them. There was no time to run. Stanley did the only thing he could. He let go of the basket and threw himself sideways, pulling Poppy down, flattening them both to the wood. Sydney dropped low and pressed himself into a shallow knothole. The soft tail brushed over the spot where they had just stood. It swept over the basket and tipped it onto its side. For one heart-stopping moment, the basket teetered. The precious pudding, their whole reason for coming, was about to spill into a sticky, obvious mess under the cat's nose. But the basket had been woven well and lined with cloth. It rolled onto its side, and the pudding, snug in its soft cradle, stayed safely inside. Pepper felt the tiny resistance against his tail. He paused and looked back, green eyes curious. He took a step toward the strange, small bundle he had never seen before. This was the end. They were found. Then a sound broke the silence from the scullery. A bold little mouse, full of the night's feast, skittered across the stone floor. Pepper's head snapped round. A mouse was far more interesting than a small, odd bundle. With a flick of his tail and a bright little chirp, he sprang from the table and vanished into the scullery shadows in chase. The Wicklings lay shaking, hearts pounding like trapped birds. The danger had passed as quickly as it had come. Without a word, they set the basket upright. The pudding was safe. They shared a look of shaky, shining relief. Then, with speed born of fright, they scrambled the last few feet to the table leg, tied on the wool rope to secure the pudding, and began their desperate climb down. The pinch of peril was over, but the whisper of that swishing gray tail would stay with them forever. Chapter 19. The Sweet Retreat. A rush of energy pushed them on, turning fear into speed. The climb down the carved table leg was a frantic scramble, not the careful descent of before. Stanley went first, half sliding, his feet finding the grooves and curls in the wood. The basket, now tied tight with a woolen cord, was lowered after him, bumping softly against the leg. Sydney and Poppy followed, quick and silent. The moment their feet touched the cold flagstones, they didn't pause. The scuffling from the scullery, where Pepper chased the mouse, could stop any second. They had to vanish. Poppy grabbed the folded basket, heavy now with its sweet treasure, and hugged it to her chest. Stanley snatched up the safety pin grappling hook and the coiled rope. Sydney took the rear and waved them forward with a sharp gesture. "To the wall! Now!" They dashed across the moonlit floor. A run that felt like crossing a wide, open plain. Every shadow looked like a returning cat. They reached the deep darkness at the base of the wall where floor met skirting board and pressed themselves into it, hearts thudding. The rope. They had to get the rope. It still dangled from the ceiling crack, a silver thread in the moonlight, a clear clue to their escape if Pepper saw it. "Quickly," Sydney whispered. Stanley hefted the safety pin. It was a trick he had practiced. He swung and let it fly, not at the crack, but at the rope a few inches below the nail. The pin whirled, caught the rope, and wound round it. Stanley tugged hard. With a soft swish, the rope slipped free and fell in a heap beside them. No sign left behind. Now for their own escape. They scuttled along the baseboard to the big chewed hole, the mouth of the mouse run back to the safety of the walls. One by one, they crawled inside, leaving the vast, dangerous kitchen for the tight, comforting dark. They didn't stop. They moved through the familiar passages, the pudding's rich smell filling the narrow tunnel with a promise of joy. The farther they got from the kitchen, the more their fear melted into light, bubbling excitement. They had done it. They had faced the gray giant in his own lair, and won. When they tumbled through the hidden panel into their attic home, a wave of relief met them. Beatrix and the twins rushed forward, worry melting into smiles. "You're safe!" Beatrix cried, pulling them into a hug. "We got it!" Poppy gasped, holding up the basket. The rich, dark pudding gleamed in the cloth, the attic filled with excited whispers and happy tears. The potato, the sprouts, the beans, the egg, the flour, the butter, the turkey tail mushroom, everything had led to this moment. The crown jewel of the feast was theirs. They were safe. They were together. And they had the pudding. The sweet retreat was over. The celebration was about to begin. Chapter 20. A Christmas in the Attic. The safe return of the pudding team brought a celebration so deep it was almost silent. In the warm, golden candlelight, hugs were tight and words were few. The shine on every face said it all. They had done it. Against all odds, the Christmas campaign was a complete success. Beatrix moved at once, turning joy into action. Right then, no time to waste. This feast won't cook itself. The quiet attic became the busiest, happiest little kitchen in all of England. The turkey tail mushrooms were ground to a fine powder and simmered in a thimble of water with a precious pinch of salt. A rich, savory broth rose up, deep and meaty, their very own turkey. The potato was carefully grated, mixed with a few crumbs of the stolen flour and a tiny bit of water, then pan-fried on the watch case stove into crispy, golden potato cakes. The Brussels sprouts and beans were boiled until tender. The single, splendid egg was whisked with a dot of butter and a sprinkle of flour. Beatrix poured the mix into a tiny, preheated acorn cap, and they watched, wide-eyed, as it puffed into a perfect, golden Yorkshire pudding. A small miracle. Last came the star of the show, the Christmas pudding. Beatrix gently warmed a small piece of their treasure in a delicate scallop shell until the spices bloomed, filling the attic with cinnamon, nutmeg, and joy. The feast was fit for the bravest king, set out on a table made from a gift box and a polished wooden tile. There were potato cakes, buttery beans, the savory mushroom turkey, the spectacular Yorkshire pudding, and the glorious dark pudding. Just as they were about to sit, a soft scratch came at the panel. Mary slipped inside, glowing with excitement. She had changed into a warm nightgown and carried a tiny cloth-wrapped parcel in her hands. "I brought contributions," she whispered. She unwrapped a quarter of a mince pie and 6 shining ruby-red cranberries. The Wicklings gasped with delight. These final touches made the feast truly legendary. They sat in a circle around their magnificent meal. For a moment, there was a holy hush as they looked at the bounty before them, won not by luck, but by courage and friendship. Then the feast began, merry, messy, and wonderful. There were happy cries over the fluffiness of the Yorkshire pudding, soft sighs for the rich turkey broth, and pure bliss with every sticky, fruity bite of the Christmas pudding. They ate until they could eat no more, tiny bellies full, and hearts even fuller. Afterwards, cozy by the stove, they shared the gifts they had made in secret. Stanley had carved a tiny feather from a wood shaving for Poppy. Poppy had woven a small, warm blanket for the twins from scraps of wool. Mindy and Mandy gave their parents a beautiful, smooth pebble they had found and polished in the stream near the mole tunnels. Simple gifts, but made with love, and that made them priceless. Mary sat among them not as a giant from another world, but as one of them. She listened as they retold the heist, each telling a little bigger and braver than before. The prowling cat larger, the space under the floor wider, their courage brighter. Outside, the night was cold and clear. From far below, the faint, sweet sound of a Christmas carol sung by the last servants drifted up through the house. The Wicklings and Mary fell quiet, listening. Sidney put his arm around Beatrix. "This," he said softly, looking at his family and their dear friend, "this is the real treasure. Not the food, not the gifts. This." Mary smiled and touched the golden locket, now safely back on a new chain. It was the best Christmas adventure I could ever imagine. Safe and warm in their hidden attic, surrounded by the signs of their brave journey, they all knew it was true. The greatest feast wasn't on the table at all. It was in the shared joy, the whispered secrets, and the unbreakable bond of friendship that made it all possible. It was, without a doubt, the most perfect Christmas any of them had ever known.
This was The Wicklings and the Great Christmas Heist, written by Beryl Coops.
This was one of the books in this series of stories about the little folk, the Wicklings. If you enjoyed this short story, please check out the playlist under the family, comedy, humor, and feel-good title on my YouTube channel for more like this.
I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Beryl Coops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.